Nicodemus here. On this episode, I wanted to discuss an interesting event that happened recently. I was thinking about a colleague that I hadn't seen in probably like a year and a half. And I was just wondering, like, how is this guy doing? It's surprising I just haven't heard from him. And literally 2 days later, he texted me. He'd moved to another country. He was thinking about me and wanted to connect. He was back in town. So I thought that was just super interesting, and I wanted to figure out what your thoughts on were that.
Yeah, my own experience of it too, and I've talked to a lot of people extensively over the years about it. For me, I used to have very interesting thing. It was a joke with my brother and I growing up. He would ask me, "What's going to happen at school today?" Because I would have dreams all the time, and they would happen. Just super strange. I still to this day it'll happen. I'll have a dream, and I'll somehow it could be someone random will pop into the field or the hologram, wherever you want to call it, because the world is holographic. Or it's like the Course calls it a dream. It would happen so often. And then other people, I ask people all the time, how many of you have thought about someone and then they just showed up or they just called you? You haven't talked to them in years, or like you're sharing. Yeah, I think if we understand that all minds are joined, the Course says. So all minds are one mind. It appears that we have our own private thoughts and our own private body. So it's like you're there, sitting there, I'm talking. I have my own thought processes within me. It seems like it's in my body. But this is what science can't figure out. They don't know where the mind is. The brain is in the body. But if you look at like the mystics, the mind is beyond the body, and it connects us to something beyond the body, whether you call it the spirit that moves through all things, the Native Americans called it, whether you call it essence or consciousness, true creative, essence or consciousness, all these different names for it, the field. You start to realize that your mind hooks you into that in some way. And in India, they're called siddhis, they're powers. So a lot of the yogis could master these powers where they had crazy abilities. Like if I were to explain it to you, a lot of people would go like, that's just hogwash. You wouldn't believe. I mean, I actually have hesitated sharing them with people over the years because most people just wouldn't believe it, When you understand how the siddhis go about and how the yogis could train for them, you also start to, and you start to realize that in many ways, to a lot of the great masters and people that are enlightened, they always believe that siddhis or psychic powers or abilities were a distraction. They could, because you could stop there, and now you closed off the awakening. The Course would call it the atonement. The awakening, moksha, or liberation. You close it off because it's like a detour into power, psychic abilities. People can get in like manifesting and have it be a certain way. They get this like control, and it can become very egocentric. So it's interesting with Course in Miracles, Helen started having psychic abilities for 3 months going up to scribing the Course. And it was very disturbing for her at first. She did not. Now, again, we talked about in the previous recordings that they didn't really have a framework for stuff like this. For somebody like me that studied and read so many gurus, I mean, like gurus that I resonate with, almost no one's even heard of them, and you're talking, there are stories about them. I've even had my own mystical experiences with these teachers and people that just showed up out of nowhere that you'd be like, how do you know who that? This happened on the dolphin trip once where I'd never met someone who's even been to these ashrams, and they're like, how do you know who that is? And it's this kismet experience. Well, these gurus and these teachers, the great ones, if you ask them, how do you do this? They would say like, I don't do anything. God does everything. So they weren't even taking deliverance of these abilities. What you start to realize, though, is some of this stuff just happens almost naturally as part of the awakening. And, you know, in Course of Miracles and Lessons, they talk about light episodes. Helen was she had very specific psychic abilities. Like, for instance, I don't know if we talked about it on one of the previous recordings as well, as one of their friends, Bill's friends, she was like, is thinking of killing himself. And we have to call him. And he was, and they called him, and like, they really helped him. She also started having, Bill would go on vacation, and she would tell him what the walls and the wallpaper looked like, which is very interesting because when we were growing up, we learned, my brothers and I, and my older brother specifically, we learned there was a guy who was raised in New Jersey in the Pine Barrens by an old Apache scout that learned the ways of the Native Americans. And they would talk about things like invisibility and being able to like experience like being able to see in other places. And my brother, they would have like practices and go deep into meditation. You have to tell what the person where they were, like something in the room, you know, where you could remote viewing, and just all this stuff is possible within consciousness. If you understand consciousness, all that stuff isn't really that far out anymore, especially in this day and age. The question is, what is it all for? What Helen, she also had she had to make a choice. And one of her first visions was she saw a scroll. In the center of the scroll, it said, God is. And on the left of the scroll, it had writing where she could read the past. And on the right, it had writing where she could read and see the future. And she had to make a choice of like, do I want those psychic abilities? Because she started to get fascinated with it. And with that, in the fascination of it, she started to think of like she could use this for herself. And one of the things Jesus said to her is, you were in danger, and danger is like in quotes. It's not really like ultimately nothing real can be threatened, but you were in danger of going into egocentricity. So in her first vision, right before she started hearing the voice for the course, when she saw that vision of the scroll of God is, she in the vision had to make a choice, that she rolled the scroll up so she couldn't see the future or the past. And she gave up the psychic abilities. It was like, I just want God. And that, I think, in the end for us is a really great, you know, really almost to wrap up this type of conversation, is things like that happen. All minds are joined. The real power is being able to offer blessings in if we call it like the mind, we're all minds in the mind of God. To only offer blessing in our thoughts and forgiveness and gratitude for all beings, because that impacts the entire, what the Course calls the sonship rays of the sun, right? All beings. That impacts all of it. So we start to use our mind constructively rather than, we could still marvel at like, wow, all minds are joined. Like, he called me. That's so awesome. We're all connected. But we don't need to chase after those things and try to master them for like, to make our dream be better and try to get power and control in it, when all those things can be used to show us the eternal nature of life and that we're all connected, and that to only offer thoughts of blessing and healing and forgiveness, because that impacts the entire sonship. That in the end is really the only path and the only thing worth acquiring in the end.